Hi, everybody. Thank you, and welcome to Thinking Like a Programmer with Advanced Macros. I'm here with Daniel Brunn out of Denmark, and I'm Treyson Marks, and we're very excited to do this presentation for you guys and have a discussion around some advanced macro concepts and help people that perhaps are coming over from a programming background or want to start thinking like this, make that jump into Alteryx. So, Daniel, can you go ahead and introduce yourself real quick?
Yes, thank you, Treyson. So my name is Daniel Brunn, or Daniel Brunn Elgar. I got married. I have been Alteryx user since 2015, and before I used to work as a developer, primarily programming websites and building reporting solutions for smaller organizations. Before I met Alteryx, I didn't think of myself as sort of the creative guy, but then I met Alteryx. And besides from Alteryx, I like food, I like skiing, I obviously like my wife, and I have a tendency to always bring cats to my presentation. That's Uffe, and a small painting of him. So, but a lot happened since these were my introduction slides last year. Now I think my introduction slides will look more like this. I got a baby daughter 10 weeks ago, so that's my that's my everything. So before we kick it off with content, I think it would be extremely nice to hear a little bit more about you, Treyson.
Thank you. I'm Treyson Marks. I've been using Alteryx since 2016. I'm also an Alteryx ace like Daniel, and I enjoy being a part of this awesome community. On my pictures there, I've got two pictures of me and my son, and then my wife and I at the Sears Tower. I guess it's called the Willis Tower now in Chicago. And then I'm really big into stereos. I do a lot of projects where I like go rebuild and repair stereos in my free time. And Alteryx, really, for me, they make problems into not problems. So I'm excited to use it, and I'm excited to share my knowledge with you guys. On today's agenda, we're going to go through what an iterative macro is, what a batch macro is, but we're also going to talk about some tools like generating rows and dynamic input that work similarly, so you can see how those other similar functions within the Alteryx tool without having to build out your own macros. And then we're going to talk about some debugging tips, and then we have a session at the end for QA. So if you do have questions, feel free to raise your hand or put your questions in the QA window, and we will get to them, or somebody will get to them, and hopefully it'll enhance that learning experience. So without further ado, go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you, Treyson. So, as Treyson mentioned, I will kick it off with iterative macros. I obviously can't see you, otherwise I would ask for raise of hands. But I think depending on the level of using Alteryx, and also depending on the level that you might have had before when working with data, iterative macros do just seem difficult. So if you don't get it right the first time, I really mean, don't worry. I often sit around and think about why an iterative macro doesn't work. And I mean, I've been using Alteryx every day for the last 5 years. So if you don't know what to do, go to the community, and I'm pretty sure that someone will help out. But I will also try to show some debugging tips at the end, which help to understand it. So before we begin, let's talk a little bit about what an iterative macro is. And I think of it as running in circles. And we'll get back to that, but that's probably also the reason that I have a hard time doing it in Alteryx. So as mentioned on the slide, it's a loop process that continues to pass data back through itself until a specific condition or set of conditions are met. It requires a different setup than traditional macros. Obviously, when things should go in circles, you will have to say sort of what is the output that's going to be the input. And to be honest, they are not really that funny to debug. And again, people at the community are really, really good at helping. But another thing that the community provides is also weekly challenges. So it's basically Alteryx challenges that you can try to solve to get a new understanding of what you can do in Alteryx. And I think it's a lot of fun. I will show you the weekly challenge 12 because that's around iterative macros. Yeah. Another thing that I think is important to mention before I dig a little deeper is that I think simple is good. We are a consulting company. I have around 70 consultants doing nothing but Alteryx. And one of the things that we always emphasize is that things need to be simple. So if you can solve a problem in a simple way, it's always better than the complex way, which can seem obvious, but I think it's important to take into account when in doing iterative macros, or when not to do iterative macros. So if we look into what this would look like in code, here you have a small example from Python. So obviously, we start by defining a count variable that's equal to 5. Then we say while the count is larger than 0, and then we have a chunk of code underneath that we will execute. So first, it's going to print welcome. For those of you who don't know in Python, it means printing welcome to the console. And obviously, if we didn't do anything with the count variable, this would run in circles forever and ever. So we subtract 1 from the count for each iteration until the count is not bigger than 0, and then we print exiting the while loop. So this is a really example of a loop, and I think it's quite easy to understand that we will loop through the same code and then subtract 1 from the count. Great. So what does that look like in Alteryx? So I will just try to share my screen. It might take just a few seconds to show up. So I'll just see if there's something in the Q&A. I'll wait on. Treyson, could you just confirm that you can see my screen now?
It's loading.
Great.
I can see it.
Great. So I hope you can all see my screen. What you should see on screen right now is a Alteryx window. And before we jump into to solving the weekly challenge, I would just like to show you what I think is the simplest example of building an iterative macro. So obviously we have a from date and a to date, and please bear with me if there's any experienced Alteryx people in the crowd. I promise that I will also show another way to solve this problem, but I think it's a great way to start. So we have a from date, we have a to date, and I would like to have all the dates in between. So obviously, if we take the from date and we add 1 day, and we do that until the date is equal to or less than the to date, then we will have all the dates. So if we go back to the while example, we basically just want to loop until a certain condition is met. So if I just copy this input, I will just copy it into a new workflow. And what you can see here is that I can right-click it and I can say convert to macro input, which is quite neat, because now you know that you have a macro input that matches what you expect to put into the macro. I will call this iteration input. I always like to spend a little bit of time on putting the right names in here. And the anchor abbreviation I will show you later, but that's what it's going to show when I add the macro. I'm going to take a formula tool, and I'm going to create a new column called date. And the date is going to be, so I'm going to do a date time add. This will require 3 variables, a date, so that's going to be the from date. Then it needs a number of a unit that I would like to add. So I would like to add days. And here it gets to the iterative macro, because I would like to add, first I would like to add 0, then I would like to add 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on until I reach a certain condition. In order to do so, I will go into the workflow tab. Right now you can see it's set to a standard macro. I will just make it an iterative macro instead. And the reason for doing so is that suddenly I will get a new variable called iteration number. This will always start at 0, and then it will be 1, 2, 3, and so on. And finally, we will need a macro output. And this is going to be our data. So this is going to be the actual output that we would like. But we also need to have another output, which is going to be the iteration output. And let's give this a high as well. So what will happen now is that the data goes from the input, it adds the iteration number, and then we would like to have an output, which is going to be the dates. So I will just put a select tool on here and say I only want to have the date. And we can see right now it's configured as vstring. I would like to have it configured as a date. So The other output we have down here is basically we want to pass this into the iteration output, and here is where it gets tricky for my understanding. This iteration output is going back into the iteration input. So this is the circle that we can't really do because, yeah, I can't get it there. But that's how you need to think. Everything that goes in here will go out here or go in here. And in order to specify so, we also need to go to View and Interface Designer. I have it hidden over here. And when you go to the Properties part of it, you will see some options here. You will have an iteration input. I will define it to be my iteration input. So this is where the naming comes in handy. And I will do an iteration output, which is also quite easy because I called it iteration output. You can set a maximum number of iterations, which is also a tip. If you are building a macro that's supposed to run a lot of times, I would start by limiting it. So let's say that I want a maximum of 1,000 iterations, because if you, for instance, forget to specify that you would like to subtract 1 from the count, then it gets an infinite loop, but in this case, it will stop after 1,000 iterations. If it hits 1,000 iterations, then it will throw an error. And the output mode I'm going to get back to later. Another thing that you have to take into account is that the iteration output needs to look exactly like the iteration input. So I will put in a select tool down here, and I would just make sure not to have the date at. And I will unclick the unknown. So if I build on this, any unknown columns will not be put through. So now I basically have the setup that I need, except for one thing, because right now I have no conditions. So all the time I will have those 2 variables running through. And actually, I'm just going to show you this. I will call this like this. So let's go back to the example, and I will just insert a macro, and I will take the new macro that we have built. So here you can see, if I zoom in, you can see the I for the iteration input, the D for the data, and the I for the iteration output. I will add some browse tools as well. So I will just give this maybe 5-10 seconds for you to think what's going to happen. Good. I hope you mentally prepare for it out there. I'll click Run or Control R, and here you can see the iteration limit of 1,000 was reached, and the obvious reason is that we don't have anything about conditions in here. And what you should try to understand is that the records that goes into the iteration input is basically going in here. So when there's 0 records going in the iteration output, it will stop running. So I will put in a filter that says I will only let the records through as long as the date is less than or equal to, I'll go to custom filter, so less than or equal to, and the to date. So as soon as the date gets to a point where it's equal to the to date, there will come 0 records through here, and then we will get to the point that we need to do. Good. So let's try to jump back. I'll try to run it again. And now you can see it runs 366 iterations, and you can see we get all the dates in between the two. So that's an example of a really simple iterative macro. I'll get back to you on why we should not build an iterative macro for doing this, but for now, bear with me. Now we will go into a little bit more complex example. So if we remove this, this is what a weekly challenge usually look like. We have an input. Here you see we have an analyst with the ID and a manager ID. And then it has an output saying that we would like to know. So the analyst is referring to the manager, referring to a director, and this is 1 level above, 2 levels above, 3 levels above, 4 levels above, and so it continues down here. And basically the idea of the weekly challenges is to go from the input to the output. Good. So the idea here is to say we would like, if we just take this, we could join the one output with the other output, and then we can say we would like to join the ID with the manager ID. And if you press Ctrl-Shift-B, you will get all browsers. And what you can see here is that now we can see a manager is referring to a director, an analyst is referring to a manager, director to vice president to CEO, and so on. And basically we could do it all over again. So we could take this and this, and now we could join the so now we have to say the manager refers to the director, and we can take the right manager ID and take the manager ID. Sorry. Just need to do it with the right ID. Yeah, so now we can see the manager refers to director to vice president and so on. And we could continue doing this, but you can already see now it's starting to get messy. And one of the points I will make later is that we don't necessarily know how many levels that are going to be there. So we need a process that does basically the same thing until we have the full hierarchy. So I'll show you. I have it pre-built. So here you can see the iteration input. And you can see the data input. And the reason it's built with 2 inputs is so that you can actually connect the same input twice and then only iterate over whatever's left and join it to this original data set. So we will start by joining just the way I showed you before, the manager ID on the ID. I'll just run this. And here you can see the same thing as before. The manager refers to the director, analyst to manager, and so on. We remove the unwanted fields, which are everything but the but the employee, the right employee. And then we add a hierarchy number. And this will go to the output. So here we can see sort of the first level hierarchy. And then we also take the right manager ID and make that the manager ID. And we still have the employee and the ID. So again, we go back to setup where we have exactly the same as here. So input always needs to be, or output always needs to be the same as the input, which it will be here. So this is going back into the iteration. It's going through. Then the hierarchy level will be the engine iteration number +1. So next time it will be 2 and 3 and 4 and so on. So let's save this macro and let's go in here. I'll say insert macro and I will add the macro. And now I can add here and here. And let's see what happens. Great. So here you can see now we know the manager, first level director, analyst, manager, director, vice president, and so on. So that's the idea of iterative macros. It's really doing the same thing a lot of times. But I will just go back to the slides. Let me know when you can see the slides again. Can you see the slides?
I see that you're on slide number 9, but I don't see your screen if you're sharing.
Okay, good. So I think what's important to emphasize is that iterative macros are difficult to build, which also means that they are probably difficult for your peers to understand. So if you're working with other people on projects, they are usually difficult to understand. So my first thing is when you can solve it in another way, then do so in the concept of KISS. Google it if you don't already know it. So the 2 times that you should use iterative macros is when the first iteration provides input for the next iteration, and then the next iteration for the next iteration, and so on. That's usually sort of a good way to think of it. So in the case with the managers and so on, the first iteration will be the input for the next iteration. And the second time is when you don't know the number of iterations. I will show in the tips and tricks, but basically, often when you connect to APIs, it will give you the number of records. And if you know the number of records and you divide it by a number of records that you can pull for each call, then obviously you know the number of iterations, and then you don't need a iterative macro. And obviously, do not use when there's another solution. So I think or at least I hope, I showed you the concept of iterative macros. And in the tips and tricks session, or part of the presentation, I will also show you how you can solve it in a much easier way. So I will give the word back to Treyson to talk about batch macros. So Treyson, take it away.
Thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate that overview that you did for us. And we're going to take some of the concepts he discussed here and talk about batch macros, which work different, but it's also, in other ways, quote-unquote, advanced concepts for macro creation, where you are similarly doing multiple processes, where the iterative is, like Daniel mentioned, on a loop. The batch macro works in batches. So we're just going to go right ahead into it. So batch macros, what do we have here? It's a process that takes a set of parameters that's given to us and pushes those parameters against the process to provide different results for every iteration or batch that's run through that macro. If you're familiar with a for loop in Python, it works like that. So you could pass a list against a for loop, and it will process all of your variables in that manner. If you're building it in Alteryx, it requires a nifty tool called the control parameter, which will show that to you here in a second. It's in the interface set of tools. So if you ever kind of wonder what that is, it's what we're going to do here. And it runs once for each record passed through into the control parameter input. So why this would differ from perhaps like a Python, you can send in a list where on this we need to have a record for every single parameter that we want to run against our macro, rather than like a single record that has a bunch of different parameters. And we'll show you what that means here in a second. The batch macros in Alteryx can also allow you to adjust your XML of your workflow, which is really, really powerful once you kind of can grasp that concept and grasp what you can do with it. It allows you to do things like, if you've ever done like changing, if you've ever tried to do this work where you try to both select and deselect something based on some other results, or you try to change data formats, you realize that it can be difficult to do both of those things in a single tool, even with a batch macro. But when you get into the XML, you can actually go in and adjust as many things as you want. And I won't be going through that here, but I have some articles written that will explain that in a deeper level. We'll be going through XML, but not that particular use case. And then this is also not very fun to debug. So we will show some tips and tricks for doing that, but it can be quite a burden if you didn't build it and you don't really understand this concept of batch macros. So the same but different. It's the same as an iterative macro in that it'll run through a process multiple times. But it's different in that it doesn't work on a loop and it doesn't depend on the results from the previous run. So if we take a look at this little diagram that we've got set up, we have in our black dot, we've got an input. And the input for Alteryx isn't always required. And I'll tell you what that means in a second. But that input is passed into our macro process. And then we have a list of parameters that come in through our control parameter section. And then those control parameters are applied against that list of that set of data, this optional input, based on how you build out that macro. And then all of the results are going to be, the results of that data pushed against the first parameter, then that data pushed against the second parameter, then that data pushed against the third parameter, et cetera, however many you push in there. A big difference here is that there's no exit parameter need or exit condition that is needed. If you have 1,000 parameters, it'll run 1,000 times. If you have 2 parameters, it'll run twice. So it will never continue to loop on into infinity because it's not how this one works. We mentioned the XML real quick. There's an XML view, which you can enable on your workflow, and I'll give you some instructions for that. We're going to look at it, but we won't talk about how to do that today. But I did want to show you that like every tool that you're looking at has this XML underlying code for them. So if you look here, this is just a tool container, so you can see that it hasn't been disabled and it hasn't been folded, and then there's a bunch of information about the style. So all that exists as part of this tool. And we can actually go in and adjust that. So if we wanted to change that disabled value to true based on some parameter we pass, it becomes very powerful. And we will show you how that works today. And I'm actually going to do that right now. So let me get my presentation going. Hopefully. Quickly. And while it's thinking, I also, as part of the resources for this course that you guys are taking today, when you download this presentation and the slides afterwards, there are some links to different, like if you're a reader and you learn better that way, there are a few articles, examples of how to build macros, batch macros, iterative macros, as well as this XML view piece. Okay, so my screen's up. We have two sets of data here, which we won't talk about this one yet, but essentially we have this list of people. So it's myself, Daniel, Heather, who's another ACE who presented yesterday, Tuvi, who is the boss of ACEs, so she tells us what to do, and then Mark, who, if you guys know Mark Crew, he's very popular in the community. So we have all of this list of names and this list of job titles. And so what I want to do, for an example, is show you that how I can pass this list against some sort of sentence, like my name is whatever, and then we're going to replace the value within this tool with whatever is coming through on our list of parameters. So we're going to build that macro real quick. I've got this this text tool that's inside of here, and I am going to use my interface tool. So this, if you don't have these enabled, by the way, if you go over to this plus sign, there is a, oh goodness, it's not showing up for me. It looks like I'm having problems. Hold on. If you don't see the interface tools, there should be a list inside of this configure tool palette that will allow you to enable and disable. Oh, here we go. So it will allow you to enable and disable which things you're seeing. So if you don't want to see perhaps like any of this spatial stuff because you're never going to use that, you can disable it. But we need to, for this example, enable the interface tool. So it's this green up or gray up and down arrow. Sorry, gray up and down arrow. And then also just let you know if you wanted to disable certain tools in that list, you could do that as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in a control parameter. And what's cool about control parameters is there is nothing to set up, except you do need to, you can give it a name. So if I wanted to say list of names, and this will make sense later why we're going to call it that, and how that makes sense to us as the user. Sorry, and then we can drag it it looks like a cube, but I think it's a magnifying glass symbol, and then we can drag it down to the lightning bolt symbol. Now, if you're still new to Alteryx, you know that Alteryx kind of defaults in like a left to right movement so that all of your outputs are coming here. But as soon as you put any of these interface tools on, it's going to change your workflow to either like an app or a macro. It'll change it away from this standard workflow. You get these symbols on the tops and bottoms of certain tools that allow you to think of how you're going to attach things on the top or bottom. Something also to note real quick here, the second you drop a control parameter onto your palette, it becomes a batch macro. So that's just part of the natural process. So I can do a quick drag down here, and what's going to happen is an action tool is going to show up for us, which is a neat little trick. If you don't want to do that, you can just put an action tool in between it, to show if that's how you like to build. So what we're going to do here is we're going to update a value. So what that allows us to do is it shows us what's going on in this text tool. And we know that in our data field, we have this value, my name is bracket replace. So I can click into this, and I know that I want to replace a specific string. So I want to replace this replace string with whatever value is coming in through my parameters. And once we kind of set that up over here on the workflow configuration side, we also want to do like a macro output because we need to get this out somehow. So we would do that, and then we can also, and I'll show you this. Sorry, I realize I'm running out of time, so I'm going to jump through this a little bit quickly. We have a very cool thing about this is it'll allow you to show which iteration, so which time, how many times. So like let's say we ran this 10 times, it will show you 0 through 9 as a result. So you can understand, like if you're getting an error, you can see where that error is happening or what iteration is happening on. So if you wanted to go down the long debug route, I'm going to show you how that looks real quick here. We have these constants here. If you look, this is all the formulas that you've got, and this is all of the variables that you've got that are coming in through your workflow. If you are ever wondering what these constants are, these are like engine things that you can use within your workflow. But I'm going to use this iteration number so that we can see results are coming from. And then that looks like it's good to go. I think that's everything we want, so we would just go and quickly save this. If you have a macro repository set up, it'll automatically save it in that. So if I want to call this batch for adapt, we can just call it that, and I go into my back to my batch scenarios workflow. And I'm going to insert this in. So you can either drag it. It'll show up here in my macros folder, but I really just want to right-click and bring it in real quick. We bring our data set against this. What's interesting now, and I need to magnify this, what you're going to see is on the input on this little, there's an upside-down question mark. And so that's how you understand that that is a control parameter that we need to push our data into. Push our list of parameters into, which is, of course, different than the regular one. So what this means is that you can have both like a parameter input. You notice we didn't have any regular macro input on that, so there's no data being passed into this. But you can have both on a macro workbook, and I will show you what that looks like in just a second. Let's see this. And then we need to click, we need to let them know what our parameter is. So remember how I wrote out list of names? That's where I go in and I decide to select which is our control parameter. And then we go ahead and run it. Oh, it changed between iterations. Sorry, this is why this isn't fun to debug, because sometimes you get these little hiccups here, and then you have to go back through your iterations and figure out why you are having different schema on your output. But I will show you real quick here. I built this earlier. We're just going to drop the batchlist demo in here, which shows the exact same thing. Here's the one we just built. And then we select our parameter of names. And we start to see our results. Hi, my name is Treyson. Hi, my name is Daniel. Hi, my name is Heather. And then you can see which iteration and where those results are from. A few things to note is that you can also pass in multiple parameters. So if I have my names and job, like I had another sentence that was something more complex, like, hi, my name is Treyson, and this is my job, I could have it run to insert both of those, which requires that you add another control parameter on that and tell it what it needs to update. So like this is my macro, so I got this name and title in here, and it's both updating this text input that I have created. And then we do real quick want to show you like the XML view, and probably the best example of of adjusting an XML in Alteryx is to enable and disable a text box. So like if you have something that's going on, or not a text box, I'm sorry, a toolbox. So like this container here. So I put all these things in the container, and what I have is a control parameter that if a certain value is met here, we're going to disable this because I don't necessarily want my process to run on that iteration of my workflow. So the specific thing is here. So I have a formula, this is set up the same way that we set up our other piece, but instead of going to a tool, we went specifically to our tool container, which you'll notice has a lightning bolt up here in the left-hand corner. And then I have a formula. So earlier, remember when we talked about this XML view, if I click on my container, I show that the disabled value is false. What I want to do is go into that XML value and switch up false for true. And I can do that by creating a formula. So we can update a value with a formula, or you can update your raw XML with a formula if you're doing some more, like if you have XML chunks that you want to put in there, you can do that this way, but we are using what we've got. So we're going to go to this disabled section, and we're going to change this value from false to true based on this formula. So if we're saying number one, so if you build this out, the ellipsis is over here, so it works the same as like as a regular formula tool. If your control parameter value equals ace, then it's false, which means that we don't want to disable this container on this run. Otherwise, we do true. And I'll show you what the results of that real quickly looks like. We've got our questions here, and so same thing, name, title, and then this enable or disable, and we want to do that based on the value of the job. And these are our results. So it says, hi, my name is Treyson, and I am an ace, and I'm Daniel, I'm an ace, Heather, and then Mark. What you'll notice here is that we had a user named Tuvi, and she was the ace boss. She was not the title ace, so we did not want to push her through this process. And you can see that that would have been on the third iteration. So we saw that we correctly were able to enable and disable that text box when the value we desired came through. Now, how useful is this exact thing we were doing? Maybe not. It's not incredibly useful. But when you are starting to think in this manner and enabling and disabling things and updating the XML and understanding the values that should be coming through your data set, you can do some super duper awesome things with both iterative and batch macros. I don't remember the last time I made a workflow that didn't have a batch macro because we have to solve complicated things in my line of work. So it's a lot of fun. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here. Oh, actually, no, I do want to show you one more thing. I'm sorry. These are the things that I want to show you as part of the. There's four articles. One is this one is a great article. It just came out like 3 weeks ago, and this talks about that whole XML thing that I was discussing. So he's got a great discussion about how to enable that, how to make adjustments, why that's important. And then this series came out last year where there is something on all three macro types. Well, 3 macro types. There's a 4th one now that has to do around geospatial stuff. But they're all available for you on the community and will be available for you after this discussion. So the next thing we want to talk about is, when do I want to use these things? There's a dynamic input tool, which allows you to change like a where clause on a SQL query. So if you're querying things in, like, let's say you have an Excel workbook that has like a list of order numbers, and you want to query against like a SQL database, you can pass lists of things into those queries, and so that's a really great option. If for whatever reason it's not a great option, I would get onto batch macros. Like, if a really great example of that is like when the output of each run is different, which you can do. We ran up against that, and it took me a second. I didn't want to go through debugging that on this, but you can have every iteration provide like a different result. And also when your process needs to be iterative. So again, the big important thing with batch and iterative macros is that iterative macros loop on themselves, and so you need to take the results from the loop before to run the second loop. Where batch, you just need to run it against a set of parameters that are given to you. And once you kind of understand these two, you can also start to nest things, so you can do them within each other, which is super, super cool. I love Alteryx. I'm just going to say that. I'm sorry. So now we're just going to talk about our debugging tips and tricks. So I'll hand that back to Daniel to run through his first set of those.
Awesome. Thank you, Treyson. As you can all see by now, this is super powerful stuff. I will just show you a few tips that I find useful. I'm going to show you two tips on slides, and then afterwards I'm going to show you in practice. So the first tip that I'm going to show you, Treyson already touched on the iteration number that you can use as a variable. I will show you how to write temporary files so you can actually see what goes on in each iteration. It's quite simple. Maybe it's also a tip for you for other things as well. But I think it's extremely helpful to have temp files for each iteration. Then you can kind of see what happens between them. The second one, Treyson was so nice to show you, but basically macros are extremely strict on outputting the same structure every single time. That also goes for the field length. But if you don't want to spend a lot of time on figuring that out when you're just trying to build some functionality, in the output, you actually have the possibility to say auto-configure by name and wait until all iterations run. This is super powerful, but it will also run slower because it needs to wait until all the iterations run, and then it will sort of take the lowest sensible schema that it can use to output. So I'll just show you real quick in reality. So let me know when you can see my screen. Do you see my screen?
I can see it now.
Right. So I'll jump back in here. We have this macro, and I would like to understand what happens between each iteration. So I will say open macro, and up here, I'll just add a little snippet. So I'll add a formula tool as Treyson did before. And I will add a formula tool just right here. So just before the iteration output, I will make a new column called iteration. And I will call it, and I will just need to convert it. So the iteration is a number, obviously. I will convert it to a string. And plus, and then number.yxdb. So another useful variable that you will know is in here in constants, you have the temporary file path. So I'll add the temporary file path. You can see a data preview up here. And then you can see it's going to engine, and I just need to add a backslash. So here you have the path to the file that you would like to output. I'm going to put in output data, and I could just write something like dummy.yxdb because I don't really need it. And down here I can take the file name, the table name from a field. I can change the entire file path, and I can tell it to use the iteration. And I don't want to keep the field. Oh, let's keep the field. So I will save the macro, and now it's going to create a new file for each time it runs iteration. So if I go back in here, I can click run. And if I look at the logs here, you can see that this is going to be the first iteration. And if you right click, you can say open folder. So here you can see 4 different scenarios. So this is what it looks like the third time. This is what it looks like the first time, the second time, the third time, and so on. And for the other trick around allowing all outputs, you need to go to the interface designer. I don't know why it doesn't show my interface designer. Let's check in. Doesn't show the interface designer because it's not a macro. So let's go to a macro, and you click properties, and then you have to auto configure by name, wait until all iterations run. So that's my tips. I will throw it back to Jason, or to Treyson, sorry. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. People call me Jason all the time. It's part of the world that I live in. So one of the things, again, I just want to talk about the manual, or that XML piece that we were talking about is very important to the value of batch macros. But a really good way to sort of debug and understand what happens when you make adjustments to the tools is to show that XML and then just make the adjustment. So you can see, okay, this is how, like when I make this action happen manually, this is what happens to the tool, so I need to figure out how to make that action through a formula or by passing in a parameter. So you can just essentially do that. So if you look here, I have an enabled container, and so you see that the disabled value and the folded value are false, and then the second I disable the container, you see that the disabled value is true and the folded value is true. So I again get onto that XML view and start to look around in there, and it's cool. It's fun stuff. And then the process running. So these aren't exclusively to debugging macros, but they do help. And Daniel did touch on that. It's awesome. I had never thought about pushing out the results of every iteration. So that's pretty great. And you can use that as well as like caching data locally, or saving files locally, so that you can just use that to push back in through your process. Or you can also set like the minimal amount of like records. So like let's say you have some data set that's 100,000 records. When you're building a macro against it, like you don't have to run all of them every single time. Like you can just run 5 records, so it runs faster when you're playing around with it. Same thing works for like parameters. If you have 1,000 parameters and you only want to run 5 parameters to make sure it works, it's a good way to save you some time while you're building and debugging. So I think beyond that, are there any questions to the audience? We've been seeing some coming through the question and answer section. Are there any other questions that you guys have for us?
I think most of the questions were answered during your presentation, so I think we're good. And you guys ended right on time, but a few people did ask about if you could share the workflows. So Treyson and Daniel will do a quick recap on the community, so I figured we could add the workflows there.
Definitely. And if something pops up, because I have a hard time finding that there's not more questions about macros, reach out to me and Treyson in the community. We will be happy to help.
Yes, and thank you all for coming. This is all, without you guys, we appreciate the ability to push this on to the next generation of people learning, and yeah, we do it all the time. It's good stuff.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Treyson and Daniel. Happy Friday.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good weekend.